Fred.
Okay, well, let me start first of all by reminding you all that I'm a Russian German by heritage, and I haven't had a good day unless I had at least one argument. And you've been such a nice group. I don't know if we're going to get to a good argument or not, but maybe we will. And I'm also not a scientist. I'm a philosopher and a farmer. And so as the philosopher in me always wants to ask the question behind the question, and the farmer in me wants to know that it's going to work on the ground, right, when we get to it. So I want to invite you, first of all, to join me in a sort of a 30,000-foot up perspective on sustainability. Because I think that for the most part, since the whole sustainability movement started 30 years ago, we've been focused on what some of my colleagues call steady state sustainability. In other words, the basic idea, and when we first started taking sustainability seriously on our own farm in North Dakota, this is how we approached it. We looked at our farm and we said, okay, what's not working right? You know, are we still losing too much soil to erosion? Are we using too many inputs that could be damaging to the environment? You know, what are the things that we're doing that should be corrected? And the assumption was that the outside context of what we were doing that ultimately is there, that we all have to operate in, was going to basically stay the same, right? It was going to be pretty steady state. So 30 years ago, we didn't worry about energy costs, for example. You know, we had that energy crisis in the 70s, and we knew that went by, and so, you know, so it was behind us kind of thing. I think that the day of approaching sustainability from a steady state perspective is now over. And that's why the concept of resilience is now becoming so critical. And I would argue that if we're going to take resilience seriously, we really have to now think about radically different kinds of systems, because the industrial economy, which we've been operating in for at least the last 150 years, is now, and which was entirely dependent on cheap energy, on surplus water, at least as far as food and agriculture is concerned, and on stable climates. And as we heard this morning, all three of those things are not in our future. And they're going to come at us much more quickly than many of us, I think, are ready to anticipate. And so, as I said in my briefing paper, I've been trying to put this into a kind of soundbite, you know, that everybody can wrap their minds around. And some of it's now been on the blogosphere, so some of you have probably seen it. But the way I've tried to put this now, let's just assume that 10 years from now, that crude oil will be $300 a barrel, that we will only have half as much fresh water available for our food and agriculture system that we have today, and that we'll have twice the severe weather events. Now, what kind of agriculture should we put on the landscape under those circumstances? And I don't think and this is not a scare tactic. I mean, this is simply, you know, Jared Diamond reminded us that those civilizations that he studied in the past that correctly assessed their current situation, anticipated the changes coming at them, and got a head start in making those changes, were the ones that tended to thrive. Those that failed in that exercise were the ones that tended to collapse. And so these are realities that we now have to take into consideration. And so getting away from the steady state way of thinking, of just, you know, greening things up a bit, getting a little bit more efficient, et cetera, is not going to do it. In fact, in some ways, it's going to make the problem worse because of the Jevon Paradox of you know, where he discovered already back in the book that he published back in 1865, that when you do something become more efficient, you end up using more of that resource, and you actually end up then, you know, using more of the resource rather than less of it that you thought. And so if you think about that in terms of fuel-efficient cars, for example, if we all get fuel-efficient cars, we'll end up driving more, and we'll end up using more energy than we do with the cars we have now. So it's part of that paradox that we have to take into consideration. So what we really have to do now, instead of simply trying to green up what we're currently doing so that we can sustain the current system, is we have to start thinking about how to redesign our systems for the future that are going to be resilient under these new circumstances. And I think what that means in terms of food and agriculture is that we have to shift from energy-intensive input systems, which we have now, and this is, you know, organic systems are not as energy-intensive as conventional systems, because when you look at total energy flows, they're not bringing as much energy into the farm. But they're still not going to be able to function under our new energy circumstances. So we have to start thinking about systems that are based on energy exchange through biological synergies within the system rather than energy inputs. And there are, fortunately, some examples, because there are farmers who are starting to use this approach now, usually on a very small scale. through this very diverse kind of interchange of different kinds of species, where the waste from one species becomes the energy resource for the next. And the whole system is functioning that way. And Joel Salatin, Takawa Furuno in Japan, the number of farmers that are doing this now, and I think they're the models for the future. What I am finding lacking in this is an awareness, particularly on the part of our land-grant universities, and I'm part of that, that this is the future we need to be moving toward, and that we ought to be devoting at least 30% of our public research dollars now exploring those kinds of systems in every local ecology, because they're going to have to be adapted to place. One size is not going to fit all here. So this is the kind of research that we need to be moving toward. And then the second thing that we need to do, and this is absolutely critical, is we ought to be launching right now at least a national and hopefully a global biological soil restoration initiative. Because if we restore the biological health of our soil, it goes a long way toward addressing all three of these challenges we're going to be facing. Because we will have then stored fertility in the soil, which means less energy input. We will be able to absorb and retain twice as much water as our soils currently are, so we'll be able to reduce our dependence on irrigation, et cetera. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to restore the biological health of our soil, we'll have to, as was mentioned earlier, have a much more diverse kind of system, and diverse systems are going to be more resilient under unstable climate situations. So I think that's the kind of direction that we need to move in now, and hopefully, one of the things that I think a group like this could do, if we can come to a consensus around this, and we have a number of journalists here, et cetera, who can tell the story. If we could come to a consensus and say, one of the things that came out of this conference is that these are the 2 or 3 or 4, whatever it is, things that we should now focus on, and we've agreed on this, and this is a consensus statement on our part, I think that would get the attention, maybe at least of some folks. And the other thing is there is a food revolution, as was mentioned in the great New York Times article on Sunday. There is a food revolution already underway, and as Martin Luther King said, the important thing was not to start revolutions. Usually they're going on. What we need to do is not sleep through them, and so we should not sleep through this one.
Thanks, Fred.